you who don't know me, the director of the NOVA Refugee Migration Clinic, and I'm really happy to welcome today Professor Nuno Ferreira, who is a professor of law at the University of Sussex, and he has been a Horizon 2020 ERC Starting Grant recipient, leading the Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity Claims of Asylum project, and also the Sussex lead in the project TRAFIG, Transnational Figurations of Displacement. And currently, he's the principal investigator in the project negotiating queer identities following forced migration. So Professor Nuno is going to talk to us about assessing credibility in SOGIESC Asylum claims, European comparative findings. And we're very excited to welcome you today, Nuno.
All right, thank you so much for the kind invitation and the kind introductions, Veronica and Dimitra, and to the whole NOVA Clinic team for organizing these talks. I've been hearing about your work for a while, and I'm very happy that these things are happening in Portugal, and I'm also very happy that you are getting involved with the SOGIESC refugees issues. So it's wonderful to be able to meet you and talk about these topics with you. So thank you so much for the invitation. And as Veronica mentioned, I'll be talking about issues of SOGIESC refugees. In particular, I'm going to be talking about credibility assessment, which is one of the key issues in this sort of claims. Dimitra, would you mind moving to the next slide? Thank you. Right, so you might already be familiar with some of the issues around SOGIESC asylum claims. These are claims that are usually lodged by asylum claimants who left their countries of origin on grounds related to their sexual orientation or gender identity or expression or sex characteristics. And they usually file a claim using the Refugee Convention ground of particular social group. So it's a legal development that it's not new. It's been taking place over the last 30 years or so, starting with the Netherlands and then progressing with US and Canada and then other European countries. And now there's about 40 countries in the world who offer protection to refugees on grounds of their SOGIESC. So legally, there's a solid foundation to deal with these claims. The big issue is that when it comes to decision makers dealing with these claims, it always boils down to credibility. There's of course a lot of other issues like quality of country of origin information, other legal issues of which ground should be used or how we define particular social group and so on. But I believe that the biggest issue tends to be credibility assessment. So I'm going to focus on that. And the reason why credibility assessment is so problematic in these claims is because usually the only evidence, or at least the largest piece of evidence, is the testimony of the claimant. And it's very difficult for decision makers to only have that testimony to go by. There may be other sources of evidence, documentary evidence, other testimonies, witnesses, and so on, but it usually boils down to the individual claimant's testimony. And because that's such a unique type of evidence, decision makers usually struggle with how to assess that evidence, and it's very easy to then use that evidence to deny credibility by poking holes at the testimony for lack of internal credibility, for example, when the claimant may contradict him or herself throughout the testimony, or it appears that they contradicted themselves, although there may be a clear explanation for that. And also because of lack of consistency with external evidence. For example, the decision maker can say that the testimony is not consistent with what we know about the situation in that country. So that is the crux of the problem. And what scholars and activists do or have been doing throughout the last few years, it's to find ways of complementing that evidence with other pieces of evidence, and also make sure that decision makers deal with that testimony in a way that is fair and culturally sensitive. So there's been projects that deal with this specific issue of credibility in SOGIESC claims. You might already have heard about the Fleeing Homophobia project, which was a large comparative project, which included Portugal, and I had the privilege of acting as the Portuguese rapporteur for that project. And that took place around 2009, 2010. It was a very important project because it was quite comprehensive. It included most European countries, and it dealt with a range of issues that affected SOGIESC asylum claims. But it was mostly legal, so it focused on the legal claim. And then, as Veronica mentioned, I had the privilege of leading the SOGICA project, which was narrower in terms of country case studies. It only focused on the UK, Germany, and Italy, but it went beyond the legal remit. So we wanted to have a broader understanding of the experiences of SOGIESC asylum claimants. So we looked not only into the asylum claims and the legal issues, but we also looked into issues of housing, employment, access to health services, and so on. So thanks for moving on to the next slide. And in terms of the SOGICA project, if you want to hear more about it, there is the website there, it's sogica.org. The project has officially finished, which means that we are not still officially running it, but the website is still available, the social media channels are still available, and we keep updating the database. The website has a large database of materials relevant for SOGIESC asylum issues, and we still are using the findings from this project to try to influence policymakers. One of the key issues that came out from this project was how people define who belongs to a SOGIESC minority, who is LGBTQ, and so on. Particularly in relation to credibility, it came out very clearly that decision makers have very stereotypical ways of framing who is a member of a SOGIESC minority. So it came out that decision makers were using very Eurocentric stereotypes, adopting a very narrow vision of who can be considered an LGBTQ plus person or not. And they were using stereotypes which were completely inappropriate. For example, disbelieving claimants who have had children in the past, even if there had been a forced marriage, for example, or rape. The decision makers also try to connect LGBTIQ plus identities to sexual behavior. So if an applicant didn't have much sexual experience, the decision maker was tempted, some decision makers can be tempted to deny the claim. There are also issues related to the life of the applicant in the country of origin, and we came to find that there was a bit of a catch-22 situation, in the sense that no matter what the applicant said, some decision makers tend to disbelieve, meaning that if the applicant had taken risks and tried to have a social life with a same-sex partner, they would be disbelieved because it was too risky to be credible. But if they had not done anything to try to have that social life and a same-sex relationship, then they would be disbelieved because they didn't have any experience or any evidence. So no matter what they did, decision makers could disbelieve them. And the same happened then when the decision makers were looking into the evidence put forward by applicants in relation to their lives in the host country. So there was this expectation that applicants arrive to the country of to the host country, and because now they are supposedly in a free environment, they would feel liberated and free to do everything they wanted and express themselves sexually and have a social life with other people in the LGBTQ plus community. Of course, again, that reflects Eurocentric stereotypes, usually related to gay, male, middle-class people who go out a lot, go clubbing, have a lot of disposable income. They might not have children, so they go clubbing. They travel a lot. They know a lot about pop idols who are famous in the gay community and so on. So there was a lot of this expectation that if you are a genuine and a credible SOGIESC refugee, you would go out, you would be part of associations, you would dress in a certain way, you would talk in a certain way, you would have lots of same-sex partners, and you would have a lot of experiences to tell about in terms of your sexual life. So again, completely inappropriate stereotypes, especially because many of these applicants would still be traumatized from persecution and discrimination that they suffered in their countries of origin. They wouldn't have any funds to have this sort of lifestyle of going out clubbing and dressing up and traveling and so on. And independently of their income, they simply might not have an interest in having such a life. They can be genuine and credible applicants, but simply not have an interest in having a partner or not have an interest in going out. They might be a more private, reserved person. And so all that played against these claims. So decision makers very often are tempted to use all these stereotypes and all these possible contradictions to undermine the credibility of claimants. We also concluded that their claimants are not given enough opportunity to clarify why certain things happen the way they happen. So rather than offering this opportunity to clarify certain things, decision makers just assume that a claim is not credible and move on to denying international protection. Right. So to try to address these issues, we try to unpack more. Most of these issues have been dealt with in the book that we published in the SOGIESC project, which is called Queering Asylum in Europe. But then to try to unpack even more those issues that we explore in the book, especially in chapter 7, where we cover credibility, then we worked on individual shorter pieces of work which unpack further how credibility is dealt with in asylum claims from SOGIESC applicants. So I wrote a piece on which is perceived to be fake claims. So in this piece, which came out in the International Journal of Refugee Law, I look into this discourse of fake claims, assuming that SOGIESC applicants are fake because there is this myth that it's an easy claim and people claim that they are members of a SOGIESC minority just to have asylum easily. Unfortunately, what I concluded in that piece is that these prejudice against SOGIESC claimants and this idea that SOGIESC claimants are fake by default it's something that affects all participants in the asylum process. So not only decision makers who are traditionally seen as these believing these claims, but also very often the associations and the charities and the third sector that support them, and sometimes even the refugees themselves. So sometimes even within the refugee community, um, refugees and claimants take it upon themselves to decide who is genuine or not. So there is a lot of accusations within the third sector and within the refugee community against claimants who are seen not to be genuine. Perhaps because they might be bisexual, and so if they happen to be with an opposite sex partner at that moment in time, they are seen as being a fake SOGIESC claimant. So bisexual claimants suffer particularly with this culture of disbelief. But it can be for other reasons. For example, if they don't have a partner, then other refugees may doubt that they are genuine. Or if they don't want to go out clubbing, or if they don't want to have sex, then they are seen to be fake claimants. So unfortunately, this discourse of fake claims is something that affects all stakeholders. And in that article, I explore that from the perspective of the literature on epistemic injustice, meaning that by disbelieving these claimants, we are depriving them of the opportunity of assert their own truth, and we are privileging some voices over other voices. So we are producing epistemic injustice. We are only allowing some parties in some stakeholders to produce the truth, and we are denying that opportunity to other stakeholders. And I conclude by questioning whether in these sort of SOGIESC claims we can actually reach a truth, because we are dealing with such a private and individual and subjective area of our lives that nobody except the claimant themselves will ever know what is the truth. And maybe the claimants themselves are not even sure, because the truth in relation to sexual orientation or gender identity is something that it's so fluid and that can evolve throughout life, that we may actually just need to accept that there is no objective truth and we need to deal with it in the asylum system. And then I dealt with another issue in this field of credibility assessment in a separate piece, which was published in the Journal of International Law and Foreign Affairs. And that piece was dealing with what it's called late disclosure. So it's the issue of claimants arriving to the country, to the host country, perhaps not filing for asylum, or claiming asylum on one ground, but not on SOGIESC ground. And then only later in the process, or a few years later, they mention that actually they are also gay, or they're also bisexual or lesbian or trans. And because they mentioned that so late in the process, this is called a late disclosure, and decision makers tend to see that with disbelief. So late disclosures tend to be punished with the denial of credibility. So I look into those late disclosure cases from a Foucault perspective. I use Foucault literature, especially the notions of power and confession, and I look into how the asylum system forces the claimants to confess their sexuality or gender identity as soon as possible in the process. And these reflect the power relationships in the asylum system, how the asylum decision makers are in such a powerful position that they can impose this early confession. So in the article, then I offer some recommendations as to we can rebalance the power dynamics. Of course, not punishing late disclosures, because there are so many good reasons why this disclosure can come late in the process, but also to make sure that the procedure and the substance of the outcome in each process reflects the need to respect the timing and the truth of the claimant. We can move to the next slide. Right, so after exploring all those issues within the context of the SOGIESC project, as Veronica mentioned, now I'm leading another project, which is called Negotiating Queer Identities Following Forced Migration. It's not a great acronym, it's not easy to say, so we came up with a NKIF, but it's not really readable. In any case, this is a project that, again, deals with queer refugees, but now focusing on the experiences of Iranian queer refugees, so Iranians who leave Iran, again, because of reasons related to their sexual orientation or gender identity or sex characteristics. And usually they end up in Turkey because it's the easiest country where they can escape to, because they don't require a visa to go to Turkey. And then in Turkey, they either stay there working or as a tourist or as a student, or they apply for international protection and they try to then either stay in Turkey as a refugee, but it's a very unstable and fragile position, or they try to be resettled in Canada or travel onwards to Greece or another country. So we compare the experiences of these queer Iranian refugees in Turkey, UK, and Canada. And what we concluded is that, again, credibility assessment plays a crucial role. Queer Iranians who claim asylum in Turkey tend to be seen as they are lying as a default. So until 2018, it was the UNHCR dealing with these cases, and UNHCR tends to be more sensitive to SOGIESC claims. But since 2018, it's the Turkish authorities who deal with claims for asylum, and we heard pretty terrible stories of Turkish decision makers dealing in a very inappropriate way with queer Iranians' claims, not just procedurally, where these cases are dealt with in corridors with everyone listening, or at the end of a staircase with people passing by, but also in terms of the content of the questions. So questions in the interviews tend to be highly sexualized. Decision makers want to see to believe. If someone is trans, they want to see the genitals. If someone says they are gay, they want to have a proof. Where's your partner? Show me pictures, show me videos. So there's completely inappropriate ways of dealing with these claims. And again, using unacceptable stereotypes of who can be gay or who can be a lesbian, expecting that a gay man needs to be effeminate, expecting that a lesbian woman needs to be butch and masculine, and so on. So the usual inappropriate, insensitive, and culturally unacceptable stereotypes, but to a degree that is even worse than what happens in most other European countries. And even with claimants who then reach the UK and file for protection in the UK, we concluded that there are still inappropriate ways of dealing with the credibility assessment of queer Iranians in this case, especially affecting bisexual claimants. And then the problem is that we enter a sort of circular reasoning, which is, if decision makers tend to disbelieve bisexual claimants and say, well, if you're bisexual, then why don't you just go with someone from the opposite sex and avoid persecution? So because this happens, then claimants tend to hide the fact that they are bisexual and tend to pass as gay or lesbian. So then we enter this vicious circle of people not saying that they are bisexuals. So decision makers don't get used to people being bisexual. So bisexuals simply get erased from the asylum system. And this is a very serious situation that needs to be addressed, of course. Yes, thank you so much, Dimitra. So how can we move on from here? How can we make progress? How can we try to improve the decision-making and asylum adjudication in the context of SOGIESC claims? In the context of the SOGICA project, we produce a lot of recommendations and so on, but we also looked into these in a specific separate piece. So I worked with a colleague of mine, Moira Dustin, on how we can improve asylum adjudication, in particular credibility assessment. And so in this piece, which came out in the Refugee Survey Quarterly, we looked into a range of models and guidelines. And you may have already heard about some of them. Of course, the UNHCR has guidelines on SOGIESC claims, guidelines number 12. We also have a model which has become famous, which is called the DISH model, which was developed by a barrister in the UK called Shelvan, who developed this model, which stands for difference, stigma, shame, and harm. And then there's other guidelines that are, or work that has been developed in this field by authors like La Violette in Canada and so on. So Moira Dustin and I looked into this range of models and guidelines, and we conclude that, of course, all of them have the best intentions. All of them try to offer decision makers some sort of framework and positive guidance that they can use to avoid stereotypes and to protect the rights of these claimants. But we conclude that, unfortunately, the way these guides and models are implemented by decision makers tends to be so simplistic that it ends up recreating stereotypes and reinforcing problems in the asylum system. And what we conclude in that piece is that all these models and guidelines tend to focus on whether someone is really a SOGIESC person or a SOGIESC minority person, or is really an LGBTQI plus person. So it's all about the particular social group notion. And what we argue in this piece is that we need to stop obsessing with the membership of a particular social group, because, as I said before, you know, it's impossible to determine whether it's true or not. Nobody really can prove entirely whether it's true or not. So we need to stop obsessing with that membership of a particular social group, and we need to shift the analysis towards the risk of persecution. So as you know, to be recognized as a refugee, a claimant needs to prove the ground, but also needs to prove the risk of persecution. And what happens with SOGIESC claims is that the emphasis tends to be almost always on the membership of a particular social group. And actually, we should be focusing a lot more on whether there is really a risk of persecution. So I argue that with Moira that the emphasis should be on the quality of the country of origin information and whether, if that person is returned to the country of origin, there is really a risk of persecution or not. And we were very happy when the Canadian Federal Court used this article in a case, Mohammed versus Canada, with a Ghanaian applicant, where this applicant had been denied protection, and the judge in the case said that actually the authorities had got it wrong because they had used the DISH model in particular, which was not appropriate in that case. And so decision makers need to be a lot more sensitive with how they implement these models. We can move on to the next slide. So how can we move forward? Of course, I don't think we can expect judges to read journal articles very often. I imagine they are so overwhelmed, they probably don't read our work very often. So perhaps we need to look into other ways of influencing policy and making sure that these decisions are dealt with more fairly. So can we perhaps look at the European level and see whether the European legal framework can support our progress in this field? Well, I've also looked into the case law of the European Court of Human Rights in this field. There isn't a lot of decisions, but there are quite a few already in relation to sexual orientation in particular, and now one or two on trans cases. And unfortunately, I don't think we can rely on the Strasbourg court for this, because the Strasbourg court tends to just defer to the domestic authorities because of the principle of margin of appreciation. So whatever the national authorities say, the court tends to accept it, especially in terms of assessing the evidence and credibility assessment. The European Court of Human Rights just tends to defer to the domestic authorities. The last one or two cases have been slightly more positive, but still, I don't think we can rely on the European Court of Human Rights for much progress there. But if you want to read more about it, it's chapter 5 in this book, Queer Migration and Asylum in Europe. Then I also looked at the Court of Justice of the EU, and you might be familiar with the jurisprudence of the Court of Justice in this field. There is the X, Y, and Z case, the A, B, and C case, and the F case. And all these cases tend to be fairly positive, especially the A, B, and C case, which prohibited sexualized evidence. But in the X, Y, and Z case, the court still accepted stereotypes. So the court said that we cannot only base a decision on stereotypes, but the use of some stereotypes is still okay, which I think it's counterproductive. So I think we can only count on the Court of Justice so much to make progress in this field. So perhaps the best thing at a European level in this field is actually the work that the European Union Agency for Asylum has done, which is this guidance that came out last month. And it's a practical guide on applicants with diverse sexual orientations, gender identities, gender expressions, and sex characteristics. So it's not hard law. This is only guidance, but asylum authorities across the European Union are encouraged to follow this guidance, and it's a lot more sensitive, and it offers very positive guidance in this field, also in relation to credibility assessment, encouraging decision makers to not make use of models which are too simplistic or still rely on stereotypes. And we can move on to the last slide. There's still a lot of work to do. Its credibility assessment, I think, is going to remain the biggest issue in the field of SOGIESC asylum for many years to come. There is the need to perhaps revisit the guidelines from the UNHCR, which are good but still have scope for improvement. There is the need to do more work at the Council of Europe and the Strasbourg Court level, making sure that the European Court of Human Rights is not so accepting of national authorities' assessments. There is the need to go on doing a lot of work at the European Union level as well, making sure that the Court of Justice makes more progressive decisions. And of course, at a national level, now we have this European Union Agency for Asylum guidance, and we need to make sure that that guidance is applied at the national level. And my final suggestion is to perhaps also show judges and decision makers how these decisions could be done better. So I'm now involved in a project called Queer Judgments, and the website is there if you want to take a look at it. And it's a project where we look into judgments that affect queer rights in all fields, so contract, tort, criminal, and so on. And the project also includes a couple of decisions that affect queer asylum. And we rewrote decisions, one from the UK Supreme Court and one from the Court of Justice of the EU, to show how those decisions could have been a lot more sensitive and sensible. And so perhaps this way we can show that even with the existing legal framework, we can be a lot fairer for queer refugees. So sorry, I think I went way beyond my allocated time. I apologize for that. And I welcome any questions or comments you may have.
No, thank you so much. That was really fascinating. I learned so much from your presentation, and I love this website that you just shared with us, Queer Judgments. I'm very curious to go and check the judgments and how you rewrote them. Maybe I can use them in the classes that I teach. That would be, I think, much more interesting when addressing these topics. So I have several questions, but I just wanted to make sure that we can maybe take 10 more minutes, then so it's like if we can finish maybe at 12:10, is that okay for everyone? No, especially for you. Is that okay? Okay, great. So I'll just go ahead and take advantage of my position as chair and ask a few questions, and then open the floor to other questions. I am just a second to find them. So I was wondering if, Nuno, if in your work you also address the role of race in the epistemic injustice against SOGIESC asylum claimants. So how does that fit in somehow in your research and findings? And also perhaps a related question that is also it shows also sort of what my work is interested in, and sort of I've been doing lately more work on decolonial approaches to EU migration and asylum law, and I'm curious to know if if you think that decolonial, post-colonial approaches can be helpful to kind of add another layer to the critique that you're making on epistemic injustices against SOGIESC asylum claimants. And so I'm trying to really make short questions to leave more time. And last question, I am really curious to know more about your Foucauldian approach. I find it fascinating how sort of you bring in confession in there and power together with power. And you said something about the need to rebalance power dynamics as a way forward. And I'm just really curious to know more about how you think power dynamics can be rebalanced. I'm going to stop here, and perhaps we can gather a few more questions if there are more questions, so that we can address all the questions together, if you don't mind, since we don't have that much time.
May I jump in? Okay. Good morning again, Professor Nuno Ferreira. It's a pleasure to meet you. And thank you for taking your precious time to be here with us in this morning. It was very enriching to hear your presentation, and congratulations on an amazing work you have done and continue to develop. It was very, very interesting to hear from all your projects. Thank you so much. I just want to, in the first moment, I would like to share some common aspects that I saw in some of your data. So I've been focusing more on sexual based violence lately for a few years now, and it was interesting that I also saw some sexual harassment in the visa interviews. So when, for instance, in Israel, women are Eritrean asylum seekers, they were saying that they were a couple, for instance, and they want to have a common application. The interviewers also were very they were displaying a massive stereotypical questions, and there were some cases of sexual harassment in the sense that the questions were very intimate in order to as you said, they were very obsessed to make sure that that couple was really a couple. So it was interesting to see that common aspects that, for instance, in Turkey, the Syrian refugees were also facing, and perhaps what was described could fit into a sexual harassment or claim or offense, considering all the elements of how they conduct the interviews. Another aspect that I found very interesting in your presentation was I think it was one of you mentioned fantastic elements. One of the most brilliant aspects that you mentioned, and I just love it, is the shift from the obsession of the person's identity, like shifting from the victim and focusing to the perpetrator, in this case the state itself. So I thought it was brilliant. We also have struggled with that for so many times in sexual based violence, and I think it's a brilliant approach. I really enjoy that. Well, you have so many others, of course, but I just want to ask you, building on your experience, what you have seen so far, for instance, in the European countries, do you think it's a matter of improving the legal framework, or is there a problem or an issue of implementing what we have so far? And are there any training programs being implemented right now to different people involved in the procedures so far? On the one hand, and on the other hand, I would like to ask you if you see, or what you have noticed so far, that are the common aspects in different European countries that require some room for improvement. If you'd like to develop that a little bit more. And other than that, thank you so much for your time. It was a true pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tatiana, for the comments. We can take another question at this stage, if there are any questions, of course. If no, oh, Nora. Nora, can you please pick up? Nora? I think you're muted. I don't know if you're speaking, because we can't see you.
Do you hear me now?
Yes, yes, fantastic.
Okay, sorry, I can't put my camera on.
Okay.
Thank you so much. I think it was really interesting. I also wrote some of your articles, and it was like topics that I already had in my head, but like reading more intensely about it was really nice. And I was like, it's a bit regarding the question that my colleague just asked about the, like, beside the guidelines that are already existing that are great, but if there are already like innovative practices in European countries which are already implemented, like if it's more like a theoretical good thoughts, or if there are any things that are already put in practice regarding the credibility assessments.
All right, thank you, Nora. So, Nuno, I will give you now the floor to reply.
Thank you so much, everyone, for the questions. It's wonderful to have this have this discussion and have this opportunity to answer your queries. So, Veronica, you asked about issues of race in this context, and of course they play a massive role. It's almost so pervasive that we forget to mention it, isn't it? You know, it's all about race, if you'd like. Applicants are invariably from other countries, so there's inevitably a xenophobic element there in many decisions. Plus, almost all applicants come from the global south, so that usually is related to skin color, prejudices against people from certain countries. I've got a colleague who was also involved in the SOGIESC project, Nina Held, and I'm putting the link to her profile here in the chat. Nina has written quite a lot about that specific angle to SOGIESC claims, how racism is so pervasive in these claims, and also how SOGIESC claimants suffer racism even within the LGBT community. You know, so there's quite a lot of literature on that. And ironically, you know, even if you go into LGBTQ websites like Pink News and so on, you read a lot of comments in the forums against SOGIESC claimants. So there's a lot of right-wing populism and racism in the LGBT community as well, and that translates into, of course, racism against these claimants. So, yeah, definitely, it's a very important angle to always bear in mind. And the same goes for decolonial theory and the decolonial analysis of these issues. In the Negotiating Queer Identities Following Forced Migration project, we are using a decolonial framework. So I can also tell you the name of my colleague who is working on that. It's Cameron Mateen. He's an international relations colleague here at Sussex, and is involved in this project about Iranian queer refugees. And we are using decolonial theory as the theoretical framework for the book that we are writing now. In the case of Iran, of course, it's a very peculiar case because it hasn't been formally colonized, but we are still using the decolonial legal framework to show how these influences between cultures play a very important role in this context. We are not adopting the traditional decolonial approach, if you'd like. We are being also a bit critical of the decolonial approach, because sometimes the decolonial literature tends to be a bit simplistic in terms of the West oppressing the East, or the global North doing things to the global South. So we want to move beyond that simplicity of the decolonial theory, because there's a lot of agency in the global South and there's a lot of agency in the East. We are trying to also advance decolonial theory, but it's definitely an important work that needs to be done. If you want an example of how the decolonial theory has been used in the context of SOGIESC Asylum, I'm also putting here in the chat a recent example of a French author, or Belgian, I don't know if he's French or Belgian, but he wrote about the queer refugee cases in the context of the Court of Justice of the EU from a decolonial approach. So definitely that's very important. In terms of that work I did using Foucault, I was completely out of my comfort zone. I'm not a Foucauldian, and it was the first time I actually read Foucault. But because I had read that Foucault had talked about confession, I thought confession had everything to do with these cases, because people are obliged to confess their sexuality or gender identity if they want to prove that they are a genuine claimant. I thought it was very interesting looking at it from a power perspective as well, because what Foucault says about power is not that there is an oppressor who has more power than the oppressed. He looks at power relationships, and even the ones who have less power still have power to navigate the system. So I think Foucault is very interesting in the context of asylum, because refugees do have a lot of agency and they do learn to navigate the system somehow. They suffer a lot of injustice, of course, but they manage to somehow learn about the system and make it work for themselves somehow. So I think it's very interesting to look at Foucault, because it shows how we can rebalance those relationships, but refugees don't start from no power. They do have some power. And it's important to rebalance those relationships, because if we make the interview setting fairer, if we give better conditions to the refugees, if we give more legal advice, if there is more legal aid, that balance difference can be rebalanced. So there are many ways we can do that, and the SOGIESC project recommendations do focus on that: how to make the procedure fairer, how to make the interview better, how to make legal representation more available, and so on. Thank you so much for your questions, Tatiana. Yes, I never thought about those sort of lines of questioning as sexual harassment, but they are, I guess, effectively sexual harassment. They do expose the claimants to such embarrassing questions and offensive lines of questioning that you could definitely classify it as harassment. you also mentioned the fact that people need to prove their relationships, and then to prove their relationship, they need to talk about such intimate stuff. And again, in relation to that, we saw in many of our participants' experiences that no matter what they say, there's no way of winning, because, you know, if they don't have a partner, they're not genuine. But if they have a partner and show pictures, judges or decision makers can say, well, that doesn't prove anything. It's just a picture. Anyone can take a picture with another person. So sometimes there's no winning with some decision makers. And that then feeds into that idea of fake relationships or fake claims. So it's a very important problem, which leads me to your second question, whether the system needs to be improved, or is it whether it's a matter of implementing it well. I think it's both. I think especially now with the new Pact for Migration of the EU, the system has got worse. Undoubtedly, asylum claimants have a worse situation in Europe. And so I think the system does need to be improved, especially now with the new Pact. But even with the system we have now, it needs to be better implemented. The Council of Europe does have training, which helps asylum decision makers in relation to SOGIESC claims. It's quite light and superficial, I would say. You know, it's with the best intentions, but you know, there's only so much they can do with an online training. I think the European Union Agency for Asylum is doing a very good work in this field. Of course, they are working within very difficult constraints of the European Union, which has a hostile policy towards asylum seekers. But I think the training they also offer online training on SOGIESC claims, and I think it's of very good quality. And now with the new guidance, I think we have a very good tool to help domestic decision makers do a good job. So we need to do both things. We need to improve the system, and we need to make sure it's implemented better. And thank you so much, Nora, for your question as well. I think in terms of good practices around Europe, there's a few isolated good practices. You know, for example, the UK Home Office does have good guidance, but then it's not implemented properly. Berlin, for example, you know, Germany is a federal state, so each state has their own policies, and Berlin tends to be quite good with the SOGIESC claimants. For example, they have decision makers only for gender and SOGIESC claims, so they are more specialized. So that can be a good way forward, making sure that decision makers have the necessary guidance and the necessary specialization. Sweden also used to have gender and SOGIESC guidelines, but then they disappeared a bit, so I don't think they use them anymore. So some countries and some national authorities do have better practices than others, but there's still a lot of work to do to make sure that the best practices are implemented across Europe.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone, for the questions. I don't know if there's any more questions.
Thank you so much, Nuno. Perhaps we might take one last question, if there is a question. I don't know. No, I don't see any raised hands. Well, Nuno, it has been... Oh, actually, Dimitra. Yes, please.
Okay, I'm just grabbing the opportunity. I have so many questions, and I'm thinking about so many cases actually that all this discussion that we are raising today can be applicable and could probably help. I'd say my biggest concern would go a step further, and maybe it's not 100% relevant, but I'm wondering to what extent can we really address the issue through law and policy, and how can whatever guidance we have in the end help when the decision maker is someone who has specific political beliefs or specific attitudes, specific biases, let's say, because sometimes biases are also subconscious. So I was wondering, like, it's more of a reflection, like how maybe we should perhaps try to enhance trainings with empathy trainings in general for people. I don't know if this could be possible to do to decision makers. Just a small thought.
Absolutely, and I couldn't agree more. Training is always the staple recommendation. Decision makers need to have better training, and they need to have good quality training, regular training, refresher training. So that's always on the table. That training needs to, of course, instill these skills on interculturality, sensitivity, and so on. Besides training, there's also the debate whether we should have the same decision maker or whether we should have two decision makers, so that one decision maker doesn't control the process and influence the decision so much. So some countries have two decision makers, one doing the interview and another one deciding, so that there's not so much bias. That's a possibility. Or it could be a joint decision, so that there's more discussion. And other countries also have a quality control system. So in the UK Home Office, for example, has a line manager who then looks at a sample of the decisions and makes sure that they are produced properly. And there is, or there used to be, an independent inspector as well, looking at the decisions of the Home Office. But as you said, there is usually a political bias in many of these decisions, and some authorities also are politically led. So we would need decision makers that are neutral or not politically motivated. And that takes a lot of political changes, but I think it's important to work on that. And I think you finished with I think is always the key idea, is empathy, isn't it? You know, what lacks in the asylum system is empathy. We get lost in all these political constraints and the legal framework and this and that, but what's missing at the end is empathy. So I couldn't agree more. We need to instill empathy in the asylum system through training and through changes in the policy. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you so much, Nuno. That was a really insightful and rich discussion, and I say it sincerely. I think I learned personally a lot from the discussion, and I think it also shows how complex the issue is. But also, I admire a lot sort of the little things that you try to do to address the issues, right? So I think it's also an inspiration for me and my future work. So many thanks for that, and I hope that our paths will cross in the future again.
Definitely. Before I go, do you mind if I also share something else? Because
Yes.
just coincidentally, yesterday, I found out that the UN independent expert for SOGI matters is asking for evidence on forced displacement and SOGI issues. So I'm putting the link here in case anyone at your clinic wants to also submit evidence from the research that you do. It would be good to have more evidence sent to the UN and make sure that this independent expert is familiar with these issues and takes action or makes recommendations at least. So hopefully this is an opportunity for your work as well to be more known at the global level.
Fantastic. That's really, really great. Thanks for sharing that with us.
Okay. Thank you so much for this opportunity. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Nuno. And happy holidays to everyone.
Happy holidays. Enjoy your break.
Happy holidays. Thank you very much.
Take care. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Holiday.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.